Welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Anderson, Associate Director of Educational Partnerships at Stanford Digital Education. This is the 7th event in our new series of 10 book conversations, Academic Innovation and the Public Good, ongoing dialogues with authors about how education can innovate in ways that are informed, humane, and rooted. Stanford University is a co-sponsor of this series, along with 17 other higher education institutions listed on the slide that you see here. The series is co-organized by Stanford Digital Education and Trinity College. Additional partners include the Stanford Humanities Center's Recovering the University as a Public Good initiative, as well as the Stanford Pathways Lab. Each event features a prominent author of a new book in the field in conversation with an expert colleague about their work. For a full list of participating authors and interviewers, please visit our event calendar. You can find a link to it in the Zoom chat. At the end of tonight's event, we hope to see you all in our community space at ai4pg.gatherlearning.com for a continued discussion of the book's theme, the early 20th century effort by elite external reformers to reshape higher education and the resistance that arose to oppose them. We'll put a link in the conversation space in the chat. You'll have the chance to talk with others about Ethan's ideas on institutional reform. Plus, those who post a reflection by Friday, July 29, will be automatically entered to win a copy of Ethan's book, Other People's Colleges. One winner will be selected via random drawing and notified by email. For those who want to grab a copy of Ethan's book now and are impatient, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. The link is in the chat. A limited number of signed copies will be made available. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Ethan Ris, Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of Nevada, Reno. His book, Other People's Colleges, The Origins of American Higher Education Reform, draws insights for today from his analysis of the early 20th century effort by a cadre of elite external reformers to reshape higher education and the resistance that arose to oppose them. He'll be interviewed tonight by Eddie Cole, who's Associate Professor at the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. Thank you both for joining us tonight, Ethan and Eddie. I'm very grateful to you both for being a part of this series. Before I turn over the floor to Eddie, I want to briefly outline the format of tonight's program. This conversation is part of an ongoing dialogue. As such, we will be leaving the Zoom chat room open for comments and questions. We will monitor the Zoom chat for instances of inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, we will remove users from the event. Following the conclusion of tonight's conversation, we'll open the floor to audience questions. If you'd like to submit a question during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Again, thank you for joining us. To kick us off, we do have a quick Zoom poll for the audience. Ethan and Eddie will circle back to it in their conversation tonight. Go ahead, take it away, Eddie, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, 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 everyone. And most importantly, hello, Ethan. How are you?
Should have unmuted myself. I'm very good, Eddie. It's so good to see you.
It's great to see you. And first off, let me say congratulations. Congratulations to you on the publication of this great book. Everybody, check it out. Other People's Colleges, okay? If you haven't already had a chance, get a copy. It's very, very thoroughly researched, very thoughtful, and so timely. Such a rich history, so much for us to consider right now. I'm so excited for you, Ethan, and thank you for this important work. I look forward to being in conversation with you this evening.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here.
All right, so let me say this first, everyone, and this is also maybe something Ethan doesn't remember either, but let me just say this. The first sentence of the book, and I just had to grab it and read it for you, it says, in recent years, quote, higher education policy, end quote, has been synonymous with, quote, higher education reform, end quote, all right? Think about that first sentence. Now, I read that and I said, this feels really familiar. And Ethan doesn't remember this, but in November 2016, at a conference, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, Ethan was presenting a paper on what is now this great book. And I was the discussant. And I had a chance to get an early taste of this work. And I've been following from afar for the past 6 years. And so I'm personally very excited for this opportunity to now discuss this book because I remember a very, very early version of where we are today. So I'm very happy for you, also proud of you, and look forward to just seeing where this takes us as far as making us think about the field, but also really unpacking just the word reform in general. All right. So I just wanted to say that first. And I want to jump right into this because understanding how I know you've worked on this book, this topic for years, now it's here. But before we get into the details of the book, how did you come to study the history of higher education reform, especially during this time period? And tell us what time period, what era you're really capturing.
Terrific. Yeah. So thank you for that. And thank you for the reminder. Yes, it feels like a lifetime ago. In some ways it was. So this book, yes, indeed, is the culmination of a very long process with some starts and stops. And I do think that it is sort of genuinely original for one reason. And that's because I came at it with fresh eyes. I came at it without a hypothesis, and I really was curious. Curiosity sort of gave birth to this book. So I was very privileged when I was a grad student at Stanford to sit at the knee of amazing historians of education like Larry Cuban, David Tyack, David Laborie, who were, collectively, along with other scholars like James Anderson, Michael Katz, doing really important work on school reform and studying that as a phenomenon that is not just sort of something that was invented with the No Child Left Behind Act, but rather something that has been integral to American K-12 schooling for generations. And so, I wanted to learn more about that, and I dug in and read their work and thought hard about it. And I noticed something that was sort of quirky, which was that a lot of the people who were involved with K-12 school reform were actually affiliated with universities. And they weren't just sort of professors of education like you and me. They were the presidents of those universities. They were trustees of those universities. They were people who wrote checks to those universities. And I was sort of thinking, well, what is that all about? And so I dug more and started getting my hands dirty in the archives, which is possibly a dangerous thing, but in my case, it turned out well, I think. And realized that a lot of these reformers who had these ties to elite universities were coming together in an interlocked circle centered on New York City and centered on two philanthropic foundations that happened to have been established by the two richest guys basically in the world, certainly the richest private citizens in the world at the time, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller Sr. And they created these two foundations actually before they did their big general purpose foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And they established them specifically, these smaller ones, specifically for the cause of higher education reform. And that just sort of blew my mind. I didn't know what was going on. And so I said, look, there's got to be a story here. That this was such an important goal to these incredibly wealthy people. And there was all this activity circling around these philanthropic foundations. And at that particular time, too, it was a time that was a lot like today, sort of the late progressive era. There was massive wealth inequality. You had these plutocrats who were at the top, the very, very top of the 1%, and making huge amounts of money compared to the average American worker. You had a ton of racial strife. It was almost a little analogous today when folks thought, well, hey, maybe after the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, things were going to get better. And it turned out after 1877, things got worse. There was a lot of terrible racial tumult, terrible violence against people of color. There are certainly other parallels as well, tumultuous politics, shifting political parties where sort of nobody knew who was who anymore. So there's a lot of parallels today. And it was also a time when things were happening really fast. And so I was drawn to that in the sense of, well, wait a second, maybe there's a lesson here today. So that's sort of where it came from in the first place. My dissertation ended up being what's essentially the first 3 chapters of Other People's Colleges, so that first section of the book, with a lot of revisions, of course. And then I put it aside when I got my faculty job and came back to it when I got a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, which allowed me to really sort of focus in, get back into the archives again, and write what ended up being the last 5 chapters of book, sections 2 and 3, which I think round out the story. So that's where it came from.
No. I really appreciate you sharing that, because before I even talk to any author about sort of the details of the book, I was going to sort of like, what is the origin story of the book and the idea itself? And in your response, that's actually perfect for what I wanted to ask you next, right? Because in the introduction, you talk about rich people. And then you just tell us about John D. Rockefeller Sr. and Andrew Carnegie. And I don't even know if rich is the fair word for how wealthy they were in comparison to the rest of the world, right?
I think this technical term is stupid rich.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, it's ridiculous, and so much wealth that in so many ways, right, it still influences so much of society today. So I laughed when I saw you talk about rich people, because it's so fitting for higher education, right? We're always fascinated, I would say, by the wealthy, right? Easily, when you sort of casually catch the news about higher education in the U.S., more than likely, there's a disproportionate number of, news features that are going to talk about, as you mentioned, your alma mater, Stanford, right? Or Harvard and other private, quote, elites. Or if you want to even talk about public institutions, it's probably a handful of publics that are always going to get mentioned again, right? UCLA, a Berkeley, a Michigan, right, as the leading public. So even considering media attention disproportionately leaning toward the rich or the wealthy or the better endowed, right? I must also say many historians of higher education have also done similar, right? There are entire books that have been dedicated to what I would call a smaller sample of institutions, and even a smaller sample of institutional types. But as you write in your book, and I want to make sure I get this quote right, you say, quote, "These stories are important, but," and I like your but, right? Because you say you're much more interested in the leaders of these elite campuses being involved with institutions more like Kalamazoo College, right? Or Cephalo Junior College, or Berea College in Kentucky, right? How does this approach that you take, how does that really help us think differently about higher education reform?
Great question. Thank you. Yes. To your first point, certainly, people beat up on sociologists a lot for quote unquote research, just, studying things that are pertinent to them. But man, people who study higher education, we are very guilty of that too, including the historians. We were trained in a certain type of institution. We often teach in a certain type of institution, and that's sort of what we talk about when we talk about higher education. But I don't think that's proper. That's certainly not the whole story. So the title of the book obviously is Other People's Colleges, and that's a definite reference to Lisa Delpit's masterful book, Other People's Children, which I think I share a lot of themes with, sort of the theme of power imbalance, the theme of double standards in education. But I mean the title in a couple other ways in addition to that. So one of them is sort of what you just hit on there, the idea that we have these reformers who had all sorts of ideas, which I'll get into in a minute, about what higher education should look like and what has to change in the higher education sector. But they weren't talking about their own colleges, their own universities. They might have been running an elite institution. They may, even if they weren't doing that, maybe they graduated from one, or even if they hadn't graduated, some of them didn't even have a bachelor's degree, but they sent their children to elite universities. And so they were focused on those other schools that other people's kids, other people's children go to. So that's one sense. And then, I really do, and thank you for observing this, I really do center, I think, in the book, those other colleges.
Yeah.
That's what the book is about. It's not about Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford. It is about UCLA. I think I have a nice case study there, but not today's UCLA, the
Right. Yep.
version of UCLA in 1919.
Mhm.
And the idea is that's what the history of American higher education is. I think there's wonderful work on research universities. It's incredibly important, and I'm grateful for it. But ultimately, research, I would say, in the American higher education sector, that's a sideshow in the big circus. The big tent is undergraduate education. When you ask the average person, what is higher education? They'll answer, oh, it's going to college. It's undergraduate education. And that's the vast work that we do. Research is nice to have, and it's really important, but that's really not the whole story. And so all of that is to say, the vast majority of that undergraduate education is happening at non-elite schools. It's not happening at the AAU institutions. Even though they may be big, they're just educating a fraction of the nation's undergraduates. So I really want to center those schools, and it works in this story because they were the objects of reform. Low status institutions that even at that time, educated the vast majority of undergraduates, especially the vast majority of undergraduates with marginalized identities. And that's, those were the schools that were being told to shape up or ship out.
Yeah. No, I appreciate this. And I think we're going to get into this a little bit later in our conversation because this is really good. But I want to remind everyone who's watching us, listening to our conversation, we got a Q&A box, okay? Feel free to drop some questions as they come up right now in the Q&A box because we'll get to those later as best we can. But also, it's a lively conversation that can happen in the chat as well. So I want to see some things happening in the chat that I might be able to pull into our conversation also. So use those resources. That's the beauty of Zoom, the beauty of this sort of platform. We can do all of that, all right? So you make a great point, though, Ethan. You make a lot of great points. I want to make sure I keep the conversation flowing because you're going to make me go down the UCLA conversation. But
you could do that all day.
Yeah, absolutely. But I actually, we've been talking about people and these elites and how they're shaping higher education and looking at the other people's colleges and telling them what to do. But you actually have a term for those people in the book, all right? And you call them academic engineers, right? So you're talking about these academic engineers. But again, for people who haven't had a chance to grab a copy of your book yet or haven't had a chance to really capture it first page to last page, explain to us who was an academic engineer, maybe one or two of them, but then based on how you explain or define that term for us, would they consider themselves to be academic engineers? Why or why not? I'm just curious.
Great, yeah. So to be clear, that's a term I made up. I wanted some name to, so if you would ask them, are you an academic engineer? They would have said, what's that? So that's a new term. But I do think it describes really well a specific group of people. So at the end of the book, I have an appendix which lists a whole bunch of people that I claim are academic engineers. We can argue over whether I'm right or not. But these are people who shared a few things in common, and the most important things were sort of ideas, and you might call them values, but really we're talking about sort of this is like a pragmatist view of the world, ideas as tools to reform American society. So a few things that they had in common. So first of all, they had a strong belief that higher education in the United States was really important. If they didn't think that, they wouldn't have spent all this time working to reform it. They saw it as potentially integral to the nation's economy and nation's society. But the way they saw it, it wasn't getting the job done. So what they wanted higher education to do, or I should say post-secondary education, because we're talking about all sorts of institutions that educate folks beyond traditional high school age, they wanted it to perform social efficiency for the United States. They had a vision where some institutions would train the leaders of society. They would educate them with sort of a refined liberal arts education, give them lots of leadership tools, moral character, things like that. But that those were supposed to be a very small percentage of post-secondary schools. For the vast majority of other young adults, they saw them getting some education, but going essentially to schools that would train them to be followers or train them to be employees in these vast schemes. And I'm not talking about, training people to work on the assembly line at the Ford Motor Plant. I'm talking about sort of the foot soldiers of managerial offices and businesses, civil servants who work for the government, people who are, railroad agents and mid-tier executives, middle managers. So those types of people. And the idea is that they'll get some education, but that they don't need the bachelor's degree. A lot of these battles are over who gets to have the bachelor's degree and therefore what institutions get to offer the bachelor's degree. So the academic engineers were very clear. They thought that very few institutions should offer that degree, and that simply the current state of affairs was terrible. They thought there were way too many colleges and universities in the United States. They thought that most of them should go away. They thought it was an incredibly inefficient system. That was their token, that word, efficiency and inefficiency. They kept saying it over and over and over again. I don't know that they knew what it meant, but they kept saying it. So you asked for a couple examples. One example, maybe the most charismatic, not in a good way, but most charismatic academic engineers, a guy named Fred Gates, who was really John D. Rockefeller's right-hand man on a number of issues, but he was also the first leader of the General Education Board, which was Rockefeller's higher education reform foundation. He also happened to be sort of single-handedly the guy who started the University of Chicago in its new version by convincing Rockefeller to donate a huge sum of money to get it rolling. But that was earlier. So when he was at the head of the GEB, he was very clear. He was not hiding his intentions. He thought there should be 100 degree granting institutions, colleges and universities in the United States, that they should be geographically distributed in an efficient manner, and that should be it. If you wanted a bachelor's degree, you should have to go to one of those 100 schools. That's the whole thing. So that was his vision, and he had a ton of money to make that work. Rockefeller ended up giving the GEB the equivalent of $3 or $4 billion in today's money. And he used that money to reward virtuous institutions, ones that he thought should develop into sort of robust universities, even if they were very small to begin with, but then also to sort of publicly shame and humiliate colleges that he thought didn't fit into that scheme. So that's one example. But so another important thing that the academics engineers shared was that you can't just shut down colleges and sort of kick all the students to the curb. They didn't even want that. They wanted people to be educated. It was just a certain type of education that they wanted them. So, and again, sub-baccalaureate is the idea. So they were big boosters for technical institutes, for normal schools that educated teachers, for industrial training institutes like Tuskegee and Hampton for Black students, and ones that serve white students as well. So they boosted those things, and they encouraged a lot of the lower status colleges and universities in the country to sort of demote themselves and say, hey, you're not doing a good job at being a college. Why don't you turn yourself into a technical institute or a normal school? And probably the best example of that was pushed by another academic engineer, William Rainey Harper, who sat on the boards of both the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller's GEB. And he came up with this idea that he called the junior college. It really came directly from him in a book he wrote in 1900. And the idea was not to create a new type of institution or to open new institutions, but rather to convince existing four-year schools to decapitate themselves, stop offering junior and senior year of college, and instead become two-year feeder institutions into the robust universities. Send their best and brightest students on to get the bachelor's somewhere else through affiliation schemes. And so, he really actively pursued that. And he argued that in fact, as many as 50% of the nation's colleges should become junior colleges. So he really pushed that idea. I'll throw you one more example, and then I'm going to stop talking. So a lot of the academic engineers were very, sort of open in believing that the vast majority of students with marginalized identities, women, people of color, immigrants, should go to these sub-baccalaureate schools. And surprisingly, in some cases, those advocates even came from those very groups. So another one I'll mention is Carrie Thomas, who was the president of Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia. And Thomas was absolutely an academic engineer. She didn't get to sit on either of the boards because sort of the sexist ideas at the time meant, well, no, women don't sit on corporate boards or foundation boards in that sense. But she was lockstep with these folks and very close with them. And in her vision was to have essentially a separate hierarchical pyramid for women's colleges with, surprise, Bryn Mawr at the very top. And she said, well, maybe Vassar and Wellesley can also be sort of these elite institutions that would be real universities. Bryn Mawr offered the PhD under Thomas's career, and she openly talked about it wanting to become sort of a German-style research university. And but then she wanted, there were a lot of women's colleges at the time, and she wanted the vast majority of them to do just like Harper said, decapitate themselves, become junior colleges, and then feed students into a handful of elite colleges if they were, the brightest students.
No, that's insightful. And geez, the parallels to the present are something else because, your comment about, the academic engineers wanting to focus on a select number of institutions offering the bachelor's degree, right? That is so similar to, I think about the California Master Plan for Higher Education in 1960, right? That really, solidifies, multiple systems within California. So, I mean, and that becomes the model for higher education in other states after the fact. So we can keep this conversation going well into the present, but out of all the comments you said, I do want to bring out this point about sort of people from marginalized identities, and some of them also been academic engineers as well. And we got a nice dialogue happening in the chat, and a few questions already in the Q&A. So keep that coming, folks. Please do. But also, I got to talk about Booker T. Washington because you mention him quite often within the book, which is insightful. So as you get deeper into the book, you do discuss how this hierarchy was further solidified by the engineers. Women's colleges, historically Black colleges, or at the time, Black colleges, they weren't formally historically Black at the point. But you also, you mentioned how they had racist and sexist ideas as well. You make that clear, but you also write, quotes, "We need to look beyond simple prejudice to understand the second-class status of institutions like historically Black colleges." I'm not quite convinced of that. I love to hear you say more about that part. But then also, if you could connect that to how you saw Booker T. Washington, like I mentioned, and I remember, just briefly sort of thinking about how I was taught about the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Obviously, historians have added more nuance to that, but sort of how it was taught and sort of coming up, I would love to hear how you think about sort of his vision around Black colleges and what that means for how we think about those institutions today, especially as sort of being these dual status institutions, both reflections of his reform efforts and or living examples of the resistance to some of these academic engineers' reform efforts. If that makes sense, what I just asked.
Oh, it totally makes sense. So a couple of points in your great question that I'll address. So the first one is about sort of racism and sexism. And these people that I'm writing about, the academic engineers, were bigots, full stop. Yes, bigotry was common and socially accepted at the time, but that does not excuse them in any sense. So what they did was inexcusable. And I definitely don't want to set aside racism and sexism and bigotry by any means. And so I probably used the wrong wording in that sentence you quoted. Again, I don't want to set them aside. What I want is to sort of add on to them. So yes, there were these, pernicious ideas circulating, but in addition to that, there were sort of these, I don't want to say race agnostic, but sort of free floating ideas about social efficiency and hierarchy, as you note. So the idea certainly was we should have, stratified higher education systems, but it's a good example to think about what we now call HBCUs, because even the most racist academic engineers, even Thomas Jesse Jones, who was just irredeemable, if you know anything about him, I can't say a good thing about him. Even he allowed that there should be at least one, maybe two Black research universities. He had Howard and Fisk in mind. And he said, yeah, okay, they should be real universities and allowed to offer the PhD and allowed to exist. Now, they were at the top of a pyramid that was very tall and very skinny. So he thought, yeah, 2 universities. He also thought there should only be 3 Black colleges allowed to offer the bachelor's degree, and that everything else in Black higher education should be a junior college or an industrial institute. So, so clearly racist, clearly, damaging to the aspirations and the full flourishing of Black Americans. But, he was still thinking about hierarchy. It wasn't just pure subordination. Because otherwise, I think we would have seen that enacted more. So, so that's there. So even even thinking about Booker T. Washington. So let's think about him. So I argue very clearly in the book that Booker Washington was an academic engineer and that he was part of these circles. And so, like a lot of us, I am deeply influenced by James Anderson's treatment of Washington in his fantastic book, which came out when I was in elementary school, but is still shocking people today, still blowing the minds of graduate students around the country so many years on. And so I fully buy into his assessment of him. But I want to add on to that by pointing out how interlocked Washington was with these other characters. Washington convened his Tuskegee board meetings in New York City most of the time, in the Rockefeller offices. He was, people from the Rockefeller and Carnegie boards all sat on the Tuskegee board. He was in constant communication with them. And thinking about him and Du Bois, as you note, I think historians have done a lot of important work to sort of complicate that legendary debate and say, well, they actually agreed on a lot more things than they get credit for. But one thing that I think still does get missed is their power differential, their power dynamic. So when they were, really promoting the ideas that they're most famous for in the early 1900s, we have to remember their positions. W.B. Du Bois was a college professor, like a lot of us on this call are.
Mm-hmm.
Washington was a college president. Yeah, Tuskegee wasn't really a college, but it was bigger, as big as Harvard and Yale, and had as much money as most white colleges. And he was the most famous Black person in America. He had a direct line to the president of the United States. He partied with Andrew Carnegie. This was a really powerful and important person. And Washington was, you know where my sympathies lie. I mean, with Du Bois, obviously, but he was an academic engineer, and Du Bois ultimately was a college professor of the sort of professor, although he had left the academy by then. But in the third section of the book, I talk a lot about resistance to the academic engineers. And in 1915, which conveniently, in some sense, is the year that Washington suddenly dies. Nobody, he died at a pretty young age, just sort of dropped dead. The year the AAUP was founded. And in its early years, the AAUP was explicitly against the Carnegie Foundation and their work in trying to reform American colleges and universities. So there is this sort of David and Goliath aspect there. But I could go on and on.
I really appreciate that, and I hope everyone does as well, because I think you're right in sort of framing Washington as an academic engineer, clearly so powerful and so famous. I think that's a great strength of your book, in that it isn't just looking at the engineers that we would think is sort of the wealthiest, right? But also how influence is really important as well. And Washington, I mean, you fit him nicely within this conversation, gives us a lot to think about. Everybody, just again, we've got a few questions already in the Q&A, and I'm gonna ask one more question before we try to get over to audience participation engagement. I even see a few questions in the chat, so I try to sort of facilitate all of them, but if you can, drop them all in the Q&A for us. But you mentioned part 3 of the book, and you mentioned resistance. And I'm actually going to steal the thunder of one question that's already in the chat from our good friend, Professor Stevens, that does sort of ask this question, really leaning back, sort of bringing us full circle, because we started talking about Carnegie. We started talking about Rockefeller. They were silent and not so silent entities shaping higher education. But frankly, who are the Carnegie, Rockefellers, et cetera, of today? I mean, let's just bring this conversation into the present, because the questions are already leaning toward clear parallels between your history and what we're seeing today. And so let's just bring that one straight forward to us. Let's get it going.
All right. Now, Eddie, you and I are good historians. We don't speculate about the present, right? Oh, wait, just kidding. No, that's why anybody pays attention to us. So we have to do it, even though we were probably trained differently. So I certainly have some thoughts on this question, but I definitely want to see in the chat other folks' thoughts who are definitely more qualified than me to sort of comment on present day. But there's no doubt that let's just take big foundations as a starting point, because that's a lot of what I'm talking about in the first third of the book. And yes, we have big foundations today that are heavily involved in higher education reform. Lumina is obviously the one that comes first to mind, if that's sort of their whole point of existence. The Gates Foundation, of course, also has a huge sort of post-secondary agenda. And then there are, smaller foundations, Broad and Walton and some others that are very interested in higher education. And I'll mention the Koch Foundation too, Charles Koch, which I'll get to in a second. So they, certainly they had the same theory of action that the academic engineers did, which was, let's get a bunch of money together. We will dangle that money as a carrot. We'll say, we've got grants. We can confer legitimacy on you if you comply with our vision for what is efficient, for what is virtuous, for what serves our vision of the public purposes of higher education, rather than the vision that you as educators think you should be doing. And they certainly have the same targets in mind. So, when Lumina does higher education reform, they don't come gunning for UCLA. They don't go for Stanford. They are talking about these same low status institutions that the academic engineers were. That's who they think needs reform. So a lot of that hasn't changed at all. We still see them out there. But there is something new today that was not really in existence 100 years ago. And I mentioned Koch, but he's not even the worst perpetrator. There is, of course, a form of higher education reform today that comes from right-wing culture warriors. Mm-hmm. That's new. And so we're all familiar with it, especially ramping up in recent years. And so it's new that we're hearing it from sort of the far right, but it's also in that the critique is inherently political. But it's also new in the sense that these new reformers are targeting elite universities as well as low status institutions. Yes, they hold up the low status institutions like vocational training. That's what we should be focused on and so forth. But they're also using that idea to take a hatchet to research universities. So I'm especially thinking about the former governor of Wisconsin, former governor of Illinois. We can all name other politicians in power who have this vision, but there's lots of them out there, and they're pretty loud. So that's a new thing that's happening. I don't analogize them to the academic engineers, but there are lots of I'll borrow a term from Mario Savio, well-meaning liberals. Do you remember that one? Plenty of well-meaning liberals today that are also doing this higher education reform that I'm a little bit skeptical of, or more than a little bit skeptical.
No, thanks for that response. Really thoughtful. All right, so now we're about to jump over. Enough questions from me. Let's hear from everybody that's watching. We got a great crowd with us right now. We got quite a few questions already. But before we get into the questions, if we can, we had a poll question at the beginning.
Oh, right.
And so we want to put up the poll question, the results, just briefly, so we can see what our responses were. And then we'll get into this conversation, right? So the question was, how worried are you about the impact of external actors on American higher education, especially from government, the business sector, and foundations? We got almost half of us, 45% saying a lot, 48% saying a little, and smaller groups, only 7% saying not at all right? So that seems like a pretty significant amount of worry among us, right? That are watching right now. So with that said, closing this for us. All right. With that said, seeing that we've got some worry in the room, I'm going to jump over to some questions that actually put us towards some things that people are worried about today. All right. And one of the questions in the Q&A is, when you think about what the academic engineers were doing, their reform efforts, and really sort of streamlining, right? Who goes where and what colleges offer what sort of level of education. Have any reform efforts tried to make college more affordable, right? So was cost really an issue right then, right? Like there's sort of college tuition that's clearly at the front of many of our minds today. What about historically, about who can even afford to go to college, right?
Great question. And yes, I should have mentioned that. That's another thing that is different today. Affordability really wasn't an issue that I uncovered in any of the archives I studied for a couple reasons. So one, it was almost universally true at the time that public higher education was free. Now, all of that is qualified by the fact that, prior to about 1950, the majority of American students still went to private institutions. So it's not like today where it's about 80%. We're talking about a minority of students going tuition free to those schools. But in general, we just hadn't seen the sort of the price inflation and the cost disease that a lot of scholars have pointed to today. So tuition, even at Harvard, in 1920 was something a middle-class family could afford. Not a working class family, but a middle-class one. And so there were no pushes for sort of public subsidies as we see today, especially from sort of the political left. And it really wasn't an issue. Now, so obviously today, that's a huge issue in terms of higher education reform. And it's not just the left. Everybody from all walks of the political spectrum want to see costs cut in higher education. They want to see that efficiency, right? They have different ideas for why it should be. So folks on the left generally think it's so, students don't go into debt and get crippled by their student loans. Folks on the right often think that there's a lot of waste and bloat going on in higher education, and they want to see taxes lowered. But everybody agrees that there's sort of too much money on the table, and that we need to enact some reforms to dial it back. But yes, I think that is something that's certainly new, since, let's say, the 70s.
All right. So we got that answered, but let's also keep this conversation going, because if you could also think about moving us toward the end of your book, because we got a question here that asks, how does the Truman Report enter into this discussion? Which I know you and I could discuss, but I'd love hear you weigh in on that one.
Great question. So I end the book before World War II. And the famous Truman Report came out right after World War II. And the Truman Report really, along with a couple other key documents from that time, really sort of encapsulated the fact that the academic engineers lost. And I want to emphasize that, because maybe what I've been saying so far hasn't emphasized that. But if you read the book, you'll very clearly see all the times that these folks failed to enact what they wanted to enact. Now, they left a lot of legacies. They created the community college and other things, but ultimately their vision did not come to pass. American colleges and universities continued to grow. We got more of them, not less of them. They became more inclusive as time went on. And the Truman Report was sort of this triumphant message right after the Second World War, written by a coalition of university leaders, the same sorts of people who 50 years prior, 35 years prior, were the ones pushing this restrictionist agenda. Were saying, we need to open up American higher education. We need to bring more people in. We need to eliminate barriers based on race and religion and socioeconomic status. And that the title of the report was Higher Education for American Democracy. And they made the case that sending more students to college, giving them a liberal education, would literally save the United States, both from nuclear war and from sort of internal divisions. So they were, very optimistic about the role of higher education. So that shows us that the academic engineers lost. But you mentioned earlier the 1960 California Master Plan, which was really this sort of exquisitely hierarchical vision that was made into law in California, and then a lot of states followed it. And that sort of set the stage, I would say, for a resurgence of this ethos that the academic engineers push, that college wasn't for everybody, or at least the bachelor's degree wasn't for everybody, that efficiency demanded that we stratify and that we segment post-secondary opportunity.
Excellent. You're giving us a lot to consider, and I'm mindful that we still got more questions to go. All right, so let me ask another one that keeps us thinking. Really, it pushes us into the present again. So previous question was about the Truman Report, late 40s, coming into your comment about the California Master Plan from the 1960s. And then we got a question here that says, do you see any parallels between these reformers, the idea of limiting which schools can grant the bachelor's degree, and today's concern that colleges are overextending themselves, right? This idea of mission creep, which we've heard about, right? So bachelor granting institutions now suddenly offering a few master's degrees, right? And so forth, right? And how some two-year colleges are offering very specific kinds of bachelor's degrees, right? So what's the parallels there between, we've seen actually the opposite of what the reformers were talking? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, so yes, so mission creep is happening just as it was happening 100 years ago. Absolutely. And people are still worked up about it all the time. These community college baccalaureate programs, like you discussed, are growing and they're not going anywhere. But people get worked up about them. They say, this is a problem. This is inefficient. Those institutions are stretching themselves too thin. They should be more narrowly focused on their mission. And 100 years ago, people were saying the exact same things. They were encouraging four-year schools to become community colleges instead of sort of trying to stop the reverse, where two-year schools are trying to become four-year schools, as is the case now. But the logic was the same. And to be honest with you, this isn't totally clear in the book, but I'll say it here in front of, a bunch of friends. I assume you're all friends. I am pro mission creep, as personally speaking, not as a researcher necessarily, but I think that colleges and therefore their students should be allowed to aspire, should be allowed to, reach higher than what's available to them now. We know that community colleges, as an example, educate a disproportionate number of students of color, a disproportionate number of low SES students, a hugely disproportionate number of immigrant students.
Yes.
We need to recognize that when we say those institutions need to stay in their place, we're also saying those types of students need to stay in their place. And I have a problem with that. So it's still happening. We're still having the same debate. For sure. And but I think we'll still be having this debate 100 years from now, too.
What an excellent point about how when people say certain things about higher education, they try to separate what students are at certain institutions and just make it about those institutions. But what are you saying when you say community colleges should only do this, right? What an excellent point. That does make me think also about sort of connecting to your book. There's a lot of money behind these efforts, right? So there was some wealth as we led off this conversation talking about rich people. But when you say you support Mission Creep today, how do some of those colleges afford to do more, right? How does a two-year institution afford to all of a sudden offer a four-year degree, right? Or a baccalaureate institution afford to launch a master's program, right? What's going on with that consideration within reform?
Really important question. And the short-term answer is they can't. Of course they can't afford that. And they're going to stretch themselves too thin. But I think that's ultimately asking the wrong question. It's the question I want to ask is, why aren't we giving those colleges the resources they need to expand? And we talked about the Truman Report. Whoever asked that question, thank you. The Truman Report made this really forceful case that higher education will save us, but it needs more money. We need to invest. It called for huge federal investments in higher education, which eventually came to be. It took about 15 years until we got to the 60s and saw huge surges of both federal and state money to support higher education, which is what enabled so many students to go at low cost and for institutions to grow and build new campuses and build new institutions. We were doing that in the 60s. When was the last time a new American research university opened? Or a new four-year college? We do open community colleges from time to time, but we don't open four-year colleges anymore, even though our population keeps growing. So I think you're absolutely right. It's an impossible situation, but it could be made possible if we were willing to dig a little deeper into our pockets, raise our taxes, and fund higher education, which is an essential part of our society.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your work so much because one historian that can speak to the present so nicely, but also studying the history of policy gives us so much insight into where we're going the right direction or the wrong way today. So this is really helpful. The question about the Truman Report came from our good friend, Professor Linda Perkins.
Nice. Thank you, Linda.
What a good question. But I got a couple more questions from the audience that I certainly want to fit in while we're together. One is, what thoughts do you have about the impact of third-party vendors and for-profit colleges that are now integrating into both undergraduate and graduate curriculum and delivery?
Boy, good question. And that's a whole can of worms. I think we need another hour to get into that one. It's not something that I have personally studied. I am a huge fan of scholars like Tracy Cottom, who has really made the argument so eloquently that these institutions, regardless of what you think about sort of what they say is their intention, ultimately prey on students of color, on students without a lot of resources to begin with, and sort of push them to take out loans that end up being crippling, especially because they don't have worthy degrees to show for it. So, that is largely a new phenomenon in the sense that those institutions they've always existed. We've always had proprietary post-secondary institutions, but the fact that they now are able to get accreditation, not through the traditional regional accreditation with a couple exceptions, but through sort of these national accreditation groups that get permission from the Department of Education to accredit, but don't accredit most of the colleges that we've heard of. And so they're able to offer degrees of any sort with, their peer review comes from other schools like that instead of sort of more traditional schools. So I think inherently that's a problem. And it makes me worried, but I have not, I can't speak too much further to it because I haven't really studied it, but certainly I'm concerned.
Fair enough. Let me ask this will probably be our final question, but it's really related to a beautiful line you have in the book that ultimately says that this isn't an intellectual history, but this is a book about ideas. And this is sort of where I see, next phase of my work going. So that made me sort of perk up, right? Sort of thinking about ideas. There's a wonderful question here that says, who in higher education today gets the time and space to cultivate, quote, the life of the mind? Does this idea have any currency at all today in the growing financialization of the university? So this really sort of captures so much of our conversation thus far. Where does sort of the love of learning meet the need for the dollar today in higher education?
Wow, yeah. It exists. It's not gone. But the real question is, who gets to have it and what level of privilege do you need in order to have it? So, at a place like Stanford, which I'm so grateful for hosting this book series, most institutions can't do that. We're all here for free. A lot of money went into this, and it's not because we bought tickets to it. And so we can have a nice, meta conversation about the life of the mind while we're living it. And we still have humanities, and we still have basic research that happens, not just funded research. But right now, that's a privilege. That's a privilege that only schools with big endowments or generous state legislatures, which are fewer and fewer, can afford to do. And I think that's a huge problem. I'm sure the person who wrote the question thinks it's a problem too. Can we get it back? I think probably. But it's going to require coordination. It's going to require banding together, just as folks did in the 20s and 30s to beat back the academic engineers. It's going to require lots of people, including those who don't work or teach in higher education, to stand up for it. That's another thing that happened back 100 years ago or 80 years ago to end this reform movement. Journalists and advocates for marginalized populations and local leaders, including local business people, they stood up and said, no, we want our local colleges and universities to exist, to grow, to flourish. And so I think we need to see more of that today. We need to stop beating up exclusively on our colleges and universities and stand up for them a little bit more.
Excellent concluding answer for our conversation. Everybody, once again, if you haven't already had a chance, please grab a copy of Other People's Colleges by our good friend Ethan here, who just gave us a lot to consider. It is a phenomenal book. It is a timely history. I hope you do take some time to grab a copy, read it, think with it. It's just important and should start many conversations across the nation as we rethink again and again U.S. higher education. So congratulations again, Ethan. What an honor to be in conversation with you.
Thank you, Eddie. The honor is mutual, and I had a ton of fun. Thanks so much.
I want to thank you both for just a rich, enlightening, and eye-opening discussion today. I'm struck by the many ways that academic engineers have structured and restructured higher education over time and the roles that they undoubtedly will continue to play. Again, for those of you interested in purchasing a copy of Ethan's book, I'm going to do another plug. Please visit the website of Book Culture. We'll go ahead and put the link in the chat. And just a reminder that a couple of signed copies will be available for those of you who are quick on the uptake tonight. We encourage you also to share your thoughts on tonight's conversation in our online conversation space. Ethan and Eddie will be available to answer questions over the next 2 days, and I know there are a lot of them. So if you didn't have your question answered tonight, we encourage you to put it there, and you can go ahead and find a link in the chat. We hope to see you all at our next event on Wednesday, August 24th, featuring Beth Gasman. who is the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Distinguished Professor and Associate Dean of Research in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers, where she also serves as the Executive Director of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, and Executive Director of the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. Mary Beth will be in conversation with Marie Castaneda, who is Professor of Communications and Dean of Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her book, Doing the Right Thing, How Colleges and Universities Can Undo Systemic Racism in Faculty Hiring, documents the institutional forces stymieing faculty diversification and explores how those deficiencies can be rectified. Your feedback's important to us. Please let us know what you thought of tonight's conversation by filling out our survey. Thank you all for attending, and good night.